It's often been seen as a sign of Shakespeare's geographical ineptitude that in Two Gentlemen of Verona he presents the idea of a trip by boat from landlocked Verona to landlocked Milan. Based on earlier work by Sir Edward Sullivan about Italy's internal waterways, Richard Paul Rowe postulates that far from showing the author's ignorance, this episode demonstrates that the author of the play has an intimate knowledge of Italy. And yes, it seems quite possible that there was indeed a way of doing this trip by boat, by river and canal. The problem is that there is nothing in the dialogue that suggests that this trip was to be done by inland waterway. An early exchange, a gag later reprised in The Tempest, takes place between Sir Proteus and Speed, Valentine's servant. Proteus. Go! Go be gone to save your ship from wreck, which cannot perish having thee aboard, being destined to a drier death on shore. According to Wikipedia, a ship is a large watercraft that travels the world's oceans and other sufficiently deep waterways, carrying goods or passengers, or in support of specialized missions such as defense, research, and fishing. Ships are generally distinguished from boats based on size, shape, load capacity, and purpose. In the age of sail, a ship was a sailing vessel defined by its sail plan of at least 3 square-rigged masts and a full bowsprit. It seems unlikely, then, that the kind of vessel that could navigate rivers and canals would be described as a ship. But the biggest objection to the idea of a trip by inland waterway is the mention of tides. Sir Proteus says, Act 2, Scene 2, "My father stays my coming. Answer not, the tide is now." The mention of tide is, of course, troublesome because obviously there are no tides on inland waterways, and pretty well no tides in the Mediterranean area at all. Rowe has foreseen this objection. He maintains that the word tide here means time, as in Whitsuntide and Yuletide. Well, maybe. The trouble is that using the word tide in this context seems to me to evoke a sea voyage. Here's another line, addressed this time to Launce. "Away, ass! You'll lose the tide if you tarry any longer." Well, I suppose it's possible that this means you'll lose the time if you tarry any longer, meaning, I suppose, you'll be late for the voyage, but I don't think that's how you'd say it, then or now. Besides which, there are other speeches in the play that indicate that when the author mentions a tide, that's just what he means, a tide. Here's PANTHINO a few lines later. "Tut, man, I mean thou'lt lose the flood, and in losing the flood lose thy voyage." Well, honestly, a flood in this context can surely only mean a tide, as in the modern sense of tide. It's a flood caused by an incoming tide, as in flood tide, of course. I know this seems to be labouring the point somewhat, but seriously, if the author is talking about tides in the modern sense, then the existence of an inland waterway is irrelevant, because what the author obviously has in mind is a voyage by sea. Here's how Rowe gets round the obvious conclusion that flood here means tide. PANTHINO seems to mean here something other than the movement of the sea. What does PANTHINO mean by the word flood? If it can be understood in a clear sense, it must be something to do with a rush or a rising of water. But if so, where? I had to read this several times because it seems to me that by using the word flood in this context, any idea that the word tide means time is knocked on the head with a 10-pound lump hammer. Tide means a rush of water or a rising of water. A tide, exactly. And famous quote from Julius Caesar, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune." And the presence of the word flood clearly indicates that we are talking about high tide. When Shakespeare says tide, he means tide, as in tide. But that's not what Rowe wants to believe. So, for no particular reason, he decides that PANTHINO is referring to a much later point in the journey when the vessel would go from the river to the canal, on which there were locks. It would be an important canal, so important that it might need to operate a schedule known times when the locks were successively raised, flooded, and lowered with floodgates and sluice gates, a timed flooding that the mariners would know about. Notice that he said it might need, almost as if he's made up this schedule for his own convenience. I rather think that the locks would be operated as necessary when a boat came along, rather than at set times. He doesn't offer any evidence for this schedule, and the reason why he has dreamed it up is an adventure in the bleeding obvious. He doesn't want flood to mean tide. Because if flood means tide, then the author of the play wasn't referring to an inland waterway, which would completely destroy any idea that the author is writing with some kind of special knowledge, which in turn means that all the verbiage about canals and rivers linking Verona with Milan, which occupies some 3/4 of the chapter, is completely irrelevant. Tide means tide. Shakespeare was indeed ignorant of the fact that Milan and Verona were both landlocked, which in turn makes it unlikely that the author had spent much time in Italy. What's more, in The Tempest, the author once again places Milan on the coast, from which Prospero is taken to be cast adrift. You might almost imagine that the author didn't give a toss about accuracy. You might almost believe that you can't lock an airy spirit up in a tree for 100 years, that you can't use magic to wreck an enemy ship. You might almost imagine that he didn't care a kipper's dick whether Bohemia had a seacoast, whether there were chiming clocks in ancient Rome, and that Cleopatra couldn't have played billiards because the game hadn't been invented. Anyway, if you have been, thanks for listening.